Okay, Ted. I just might do that. I can always use a new outfit, and I did see a beautiful little white number at the store a few days ago. By the way, will Phil Stein be at the party? Stein? Ted repeated. Why are you asking about that ass? You know that he's the biggest pea-hound in the area? Why so interested in that all of a sudden? He asked suspiciously. Don't be so crude, Ted. Phil has always been a complete gentleman around me, and I find him amusing and an interesting conversationalist. What? Now you're getting jealous all of a sudden? Barbara retorted, inwardly satisfied that she had gotten his goat. Ted eyed her stonily, wondering what she was up to. He knew his wife, and he could feel the wheels turning in her head. Whatever she had in mind, he knew that it wouldn't make him happy. He shook his head and went up to his study. The next days were even cooler between Ted and Barbara. The short conversation about the Christmas party and her mention of Phil Stein seemed to open an even wider rift in their relationship. They viewed each other with a degree of suspicion and wariness. Ted just knew that some kind of major eruption was coming down the road. The next couple of weeks passed uneventfully. Barbara did, in fact, get the little white number she had had her eye on. She had been a bit hesitant because that little dress was a bit risque. It was a little on the short side, coming down to mid-thigh with a plunging neckline and virtually no back. But Barbara knew that she still had the figure for it, and she also knew that Ted would be royally pissed that she would wear that to a party attended by his colleagues. Screw him, she thought. Let him realize that others appreciated what he didn't. Let him eat his heart out. The day before the big party, and was sitting in the Arnold's living room watching Barbara model her new dress. My God, Barb, are you sure that you want to wear that? I mean, it's a beautiful dress, but there are going to be a lot of guys at that party, and there's going to be a lot of drinking. What you're wearing could be like a red flag to a herd of bulls. Plus, you know you can't wear a bra with that, she laughed. And Ted will be royally pissed, Barbara giggled. I can't wait to see his expression when he sees me in this. But inwardly, she had doubts about the appropriateness of the outfit and was not quite sure that she should go through with actually wearing it. She knew that she shouldn't push Ted too far. Realizing that she was being too apprehensive, she shrugged her doubts off and looked forward to the splash she would make at the party. The following evening, after showering, putting on her makeup and dressing, Barb made her way slowly down the stairs, awaiting Ted's reaction to her dress. He looked up from his seat in the living room and then quickly rose to his feet, his face flushed. What the are you wearing? He shouted hoarsely. You can't go in that thing. Why? You afraid that other men might think I'm hot? You don't own me, mister. I'll dress however I wish. She snapped back at him, and without a backward glance went to the closet and shrugged into her coat. Ted stood there, his anger almost overwhelming him. He knew that she was doing this purposefully, goading him. He also knew the sales force and the ribbing he would get days after. He kept his mouth shut, got his coat and went out the door and into the car, not waiting for her. He sat behind the wheel, and when she was finally beside him, he started the car and drove to the hotel. Not a word was exchanged between the two of them. They arrived at the hotel shortly and had the valet take their car. They made their way to the main ballroom and stopped at the coat room where Ted averted his eyes as they gave their outerwear to the gal behind the counter. Entering the ballroom, Ted quickly left Barbara's side and made his way to the long bar. He ordered a Scotch neat and gulped it down quickly. John and Joyce Brock saw the Arnolds enter the room, and John muttered to his wife, Oh, it looks like Ted and Barb are at it again. Heck, he looks like he's ready to spit nails. I better go over and calm him down. He rose and waited for Barbara to make her way to their table. In the meantime, Barbara had attracted quite some attention in her attire. She felt the eyes on her as she wandered into the room and, seeing Joyce Brock, moved over to where she and her husband were sitting. Joyce smiled at Barbara and murmured, Damn, Barb, that dress is gorgeous, and you sure know how to fill it out. Just make sure that my husband doesn't get too near you, she laughed. John colored a bit and asked Barbara if she wanted a drink, and then wandered over to the bar next to Ted. He put his hand on Ted's shoulder and said quietly, If you don't settle down, you're going to have a heart attack. Your pressure must be sky high. Ted took a breath. Yeah, I know, John. I'll be okay. Just give me a few minutes. Did you see what she's wearing? It's like she's surfing to get laid, and not by me. Wait here for me. I'll be right back, John told him as he made his way back to the table, depositing drinks for his wife and Barbara. He looked down at the ladies and told them that he would be with Ted for a while. Joyce nodded, and he departed. Barbara turned to Joyce and whispered, "Joyce, I know that Ted is really angry about how I'm dressed, but it's not really all that outrageous. I've seen worse." Joyce nodded. "I know, Barb. The dress is not all that daring, but I think that Ted's mad because of the setting. You know how these guys are here. Half of them keep sniffing around trying to get laid all the time, and being married is no impediment to them. Ted's jealous and fearful, I think. It could be that he's pissed because he thinks that you're fishing, and without a license, being married and all that." Barbara sighed. "I know, Joyce. I probably went too far with this outfit, but I wanted to get his goat. It looks like I certainly did do that. Besides," she added with a grin, "a girl can use all the attention she can get at my age." Barbara sounded confident, but she was uneasy and she kept her eye on Ted. It wasn't long before Joyce's husband returned to the table, leaving Ted to simmer by himself at the bar. Chatting with the Brocks and another couple who had joined them, Barbara kept stealing glances at Ted. She had almost made up her mind to approach him to try to salvage the evening, when she saw an obviously tipsy blonde woman stagger over to Ted. "Teddy, buy a girl a drinky poo?" Denise burbled as she leaned against him. Ted tried to shrug her off, leaning her against the bar. "Denise, you're smashed. I think that you've had more than enough." Denise Richards worked in accounting and had been flirting with Ted for years, but not in any serious manner, and Ted always took it for what it was, harmless bantering. Denise was very happily married to an airline pilot who, as usual, was absent for the evening's festivities. Denise leaned over and whispered in Ted's ear, "Ted, now's your chance. I'm drunker than hell and hubby's not here." And she then caught his earlobe in her teeth. Ted, amused, knowing that she was pulling his chain, straightened her and smiled. "Denise, hubby would have me on a skewer and I'm not suicidal." Denise suddenly lurched and turned a bit pale. "Ted, I think I'm going to upchuck. Help me to the little girl's room, will you?" Ted quickly put his arm around her waist and walked her out of the door and down the hall, searching for the lavatories. Barbara had sat, observing the interchange between her husband and the blonde, from across the room. She had felt her temper flare, and her anger caused bile to rise in her throat. Then, to her shock and dismay, she saw Ted, with his arm around this strange woman, leading her out of the ballroom and down the hall. Her fingers clutched the tablecloth tightly. "That bastard," she hissed to herself. "So that's why he wanted to come to this shindig. Bastard. Right in front of me and everyone." Barbara had turned pale and her eyes blazed. Her first reaction was to get her coat and drive home, but she calmed herself. "He thinks that he can thumb his nose at me in front of everyone. Does he? Two can play at that game." Meanwhile, as Barbara steamed, Ted was frantically searching for the ladies' room before the woman he was holding up barfed all over him. Noticing two gals from the office coming out of a door, he shouted for help. Seeing his dilemma, they laughed and quickly gathered Denise and led her into the ladies' room. Ted breathed a sigh of relief and realized that he really didn't want to return to the ballroom just yet. He continued along the hallway until he came to a door which led to a sheltered outdoor alcove. He stepped out, making sure that the door didn't lock behind him. The air was cold, but it felt good on his overheated skin. He slipped a slender panatella from his inside pocket and lit it with a match. He felt now more relaxed than he had in days. He stood there, smoking his cigar and wondering how the two of them had screwed up their marriage so badly. He now acknowledged, at least in his own mind, that there were real problems in their relationship, and he knew that he and Barbara needed help. He loved her, but they had to find ways to get back to the loving couple they had been years ago. He knew that with love and understanding, they would be able to fix what had gone so wrong. Back in the ballroom, Barbara was startled to find a tall, slender man bending over her, asking her to dance. She looked up and saw that it was Phil Stein. She smiled broadly and took his hand, accompanying him to the floor. She laughed inwardly to herself. How delicious, how perfect. The bastard let him burn. Let him know that I'm still desirable. Let him know that I won't sit back quietly and let him play around. Damn, Barb, you look absolutely scrumptious, good enough to eat in that outfit. Stein almost leered at her. Sorry, didn't quite mean it the way that sounded, he added and laughed. Barbara colored a bit, looked around to see if anyone had heard that comment, and swatted him playfully on the shoulder. "Behave yourself, Phil. You're supposed to be a gentleman." "Oh, I am, Barb. I certainly am." "You know that," he murmured as he gathered her into his arms for the slow number the band was playing. Stein held her captive for dance after dance, intermingled with drinks from the bar. Barbara had tried to keep her eye out for Ted, but as time went by, she finally gave up looking for him. She knew that by this time he was enjoying the favors of that blonde, and she fought to keep the tears from her eyes. She just gave in to Stein's compliments and kept consuming the drinks he would periodically get for her. Ted had finally returned to the ballroom, and he saw immediately his wife in the clutches of Stein. Son of a b, he thought. It didn't take either of them long to hook up. Is this what she had in mind all along? Is the dress for that? All of his noble thoughts about fixing their marriage went out of his mind, and he turned to the bar for another scotch, stewing and allowing his blood pressure and resentment to rise. He made his way over to a group of buddies and joined the conversation, trying to get the sight of his wife and Stein out of his mind. It wasn't long before he was engrossed in the conversation and didn't notice the passing of time. When he again looked at his watch, he realized that he had been sitting there for almost an hour, and he looked around to see where Barbara was sitting. He couldn't see her, and then slowly examined the room, section by section. Nothing. And what was even more worrisome was that Stein was nowhere to be found either. Ted quickly rose to his feet and excused himself. Striding out of the ballroom, he looked one way and then the other. Moving down the hallway he had previously traversed, he saw door after door of conference rooms, all seemingly locked. The fourth door was slightly ajar, and he slowly and cautiously opened it and peered in. He froze as he saw his wife in the arms of Phil Stein. They had their lips locked. Ted exploded. He rushed into the room and pulled Stein's hair and head away from Barbara. He then kneed him viciously in the groin and watched as he collapsed to the floor, curling up into a fetal position and moaning piteously. Ted turned to his wife, who was now cowering from him, white-faced. Her words were slurred but understandable. "Ted, don't, it was a mistake. Please," she muttered, trying to stand upright. "Find your own way home, U.S.," he snarled at her, disgust and anger distorting his features. "Maybe you can F a ride out of someone else here." He then turned and almost ran out of the room, down the hallway to get his coat, and then out of the door. He collected his car and broke a few speed limits getting home, trying to drive with tears blurring his vision. Ted left his car in the driveway and stumbled to and entered the front door. He threw his coat at the closet and then turned, trembling, not knowing what to do next. He clenched his fist and suddenly hit the wall with maximum force. Luckily, he missed the studs and punched a significant hole through the wallboard. The suddenness of the unexpected damage seemed to bring some semblance of sanity back to him, and he took a deep breath and tried to calm down and think rationally. Ted's first thoughts were of divorce. He would not stay married to a wife who cheated, who betrayed him. The shock of that course of action rocked him then. Could he actually walk away from Barbara, from all of the years that they shared together? He then told himself that the last few years weren't all that wonderful anyway. Perhaps it would be best for both of them if they split. He also knew, deep down in his psyche, that he still loved his wife and wished desperately for a loving and giving union with her. Ted was a man torn, pulled in different directions. His rage at what Barbara had done at the party consumed him, but he also realized that walking away from her would be terribly difficult for him to do. Ted was not a stupid man. He knew that making any decisions now would be impossible. He would wait and have a rational discussion with Barbara tomorrow. Tomorrow, when he was calmer and more able to contain his anger. Together, they would come to some kind of resolution. Ted wearily climbed the stairs, gathered his toiletries and his pillow from the master bath and bedroom, and made his way to the guest room where he undressed and climbed into bed. He more than suspected that he would get little sleep that night. As he lay there, eyes wide open, he heard a car pull into the driveway. He heard car doors slam and then voices in the foyer. They were muffled, but he soon heard the front door close again and then hesitant footsteps up the stairs. He closed his eyes and tried to ignore the sounds. Ted lay there, quietly, listening to himself breath in and out, willing himself to concentrate on the memory of an evening at the beach when he was a teenager. remembering the setting sun and the reflection on the calm sea. He fell asleep. The bright sunlight streaming through the window caused Ted to reluctantly open his eyes and squint at the clock on the dresser. It was 9:33 a.m., and his head was pounding, and his mouth felt as if it were filled with cotton. Memories of the previous night flooded his mind, and he felt a tinge of nausea which he fought down. He made his way to the hall bath and downed 3 aspirin and brushed his teeth and gargled with mouthwash. A hot shower followed by a few seconds of icy spray soon had him feeling more human. He now noticed that the master bedroom door was wide open and saw Barbara sprawled on the bed. She was still asleep, snoring softly. Ted made his way downstairs and into the kitchen. Picking up the coffee pot, he paused and lowered back to the counter. "F it," he muttered as he picked up his coat from the floor near the closet and walked out of the house. He drove downtown and stopped at a IHOP and had a late breakfast and then to his office. No one was there this Saturday late morning, and he was able to finish up some odds and ends that he had put off. It wasn't until almost 1 p.m. that he headed home, steeling himself for what he knew would be a very unpleasant confrontation with his wife. He truly didn't have any idea what the outcome of their conversation would be. He suspected that it could very possibly lead to the end of the marriage at worst, but if not that, then what? A continuation of a marriage that was troublesome at best? He tried to clear his mind and let whatever denouement come. He walked into the house and saw Barbara sitting in the living room. The drapes were drawn, and the room was lit only by the daylight trying to creep in around the fabric over the windows. She sat in the shadows, and he saw that she was wearing her housecoat and was pale and drawn. He sat down heavily across from her and began. "We have to talk," he said quietly. He looked at her and saw that she wouldn't meet his gaze. Barbara finally raised her head and said, "Before you say anything, I want to ask you a question." She paused, waiting for his approval to continue. Ted nodded. "Did you F her? Did you F that blonde who was hanging all over you last night?" Ted felt the rage rise up and threatened to overwhelm him. He had to make a conscious effort to tamp it down, not let it gain control over him. He shaped it, compressed it, and rose to his feet. Why is it that cheaters always feel that everyone else is also a cheater? They cheat, so I guess it follows that everyone else does it too. Perhaps it makes them feel less guilty. To them, the marriage ceremony isn't a commitment to love and cherish. It's only round one in a constant battle for supremacy. To them, marriage isn't a promise to be faithful. It's an opportunity to dominate and overwhelm. Ted replied quietly. He kept his voice low, but the steel and anger were quite evident. Barbara had turned deathly pale, and he saw the tears start to flow down her cheeks, but he felt no sympathy for her. He continued, "To answer your question, no, I didn't. I took her into the hall, looking for the ladies' room, and 2 of the gals from the office saw my plight and took over. Also, and pay close attention to what I'm going to say, I have never cheated. I have never in my married life touched a woman inappropriately, and I have never allowed a woman to touch me inappropriately." He paused and looked at his wife with contempt. "Can you say the same, wife?" he snapped. "Can you repeat my words? Can you tell me that no man has ever touched you inappropriately?" He looked down at her, and there was now sadness and hurt in his eyes. "How many, Barbara? How many guys have you allowed access to your body? How many men have felt you? How many men have you been with, Barbara?" he asked quietly, the sorrow evident in his voice. The questions that Ted hurled at her caused Barbara to leap to her feet and scream, "Never, never, never, Ted. No one has ever done that. Last night was the first time that any man has done that to me besides you. I was drunk, jealous, and angry, and I let that creep go too far. I was trying to pull away from him when you burst in. You have to believe me. It's the God-honest truth." She wailed and then collapsed into a fetal position on the couch. He heard her whimper softly, "I have never been unfaithful to you, never." Suddenly, and unexpectedly, Ted's anger and resentment dissipated. He felt his heart go out to his wife, but he did not move. He put his hand to his head, his thoughts chaotic and malformed now. Then, with an abruptness that surprised him, he turned to Barbara. "Sit up, Barb. Sit up and listen to me. I think that we've reached a fork in the road for us, a point where we have to make a concerted effort to love and support each other or else call an end to this marriage. Perhaps the events of last evening were a call to both of us. Perhaps that was a wake-up call. I do know that things are going to have to change. We both have to change if we're going to survive." Barbara's tears had stopped, and she was listening to her husband intently. "Ted, I know that you're right. I'm disgusted with how I acted last night, and I hope that you can forgive me. I also know that we both have to remember why we married in the first place. I do love you, honey. Please believe me, I do love you," Barbara said softly as she moved to him. Ted gathered her in his arms, and they kissed tenderly. He breathed a silent sigh of relief and prayed that a page had been turned and their future would be better than the immediate past. They were cautious and careful with their words and actions in the days following. Things seemed to be getting more comfortable, and they were both making efforts to be loving and supportive. They were both making the effort it takes to make a marriage work, and it showed, except in the bedroom. They both recognized that there was a certain restraint, a withholding, and because of that their love-making was strangely empty and unfulfilling. Some days later, on a Sunday morning, Barbara poured a cup of coffee for her husband and, while brushing a kiss on his forehead, reminded him, "Honey, do we have enough liquor for the New Year's Eve party next week? I took care of the caterer and the food and soft drinks will be delivered as promised, but I'm not sure if we have enough booze." "I think so, dear. But, you know what? I think that I'll shoot down to the store and get a couple more bottles of scotch, just in case," Ted replied. Barbara smiled at him fondly and quipped, "We just have to make sure that no one gets too drunk to drive, or else we'll have overnight guests for sure." There were about 28 or 30 people at the Arnold's New Year's bash, and the liquor was flowing and the food disappearing. Everyone seemed to be having a great time. Everyone had chanted along with the countdown, ending the old year, and kisses were exchanged, regardless of where the mistletoe was. Barbara had made sure that she was close to her husband, and when the last stroke of the clock sounded, signaling the beginning of a new year, she turned to him, wrapped her arms around his neck, and kissed him passionately. "I love you, Ted Arnold. I love you with all my heart," she murmured into his ear. Ted choked up. He felt his heart fill with emotion. "I love you, Barbara Arnold. I'm so grateful that you're mine." And he held her close. The night slowly wound to an end. Slowly couples began to say their goodbyes and leave until there were just Anne and her date Matt and the Collins from next door. Everyone chipped in and helped clean up a bit until the Arnolds convinced everyone that it was late and thanked them for their help. With the house to themselves, they came together and drifted to the voice of Sinatra singing Stardust. Was there ever a more romantic song? They had turned the lights off, and the room was lit by the flickering flames in the fireplace. Ted had begun to nuzzle his wife's neck, and her breathing deepened as she became more aroused. He slowly, while still holding her and shuffling to the music, unbuttoned her blouse and let it fall to the floor. His lips moved to her ear, and he nibbled on the soft lobe. Barbara sighed and held herself close to him. While tonguing his wife's ear, he lowered the zipper on the back of her shirt and let it also fall to the floor. "My God, Ted, take me, please. No more teasing. I'm ready to explode," she pleaded. Ted chuckled and caught her up in his arms and carried her up the steps and into their bedroom. He saw the devilish grin on her face as she murmured, "Get ready, lover." They held each other tenderly. The sweat cooled from their bodies, and Barbara kept her face buried in her husband's neck, her fingers playing with the hair on his chest. His labored breathing had eased, and he felt relaxed and at peace with the world. Their lovemaking that evening seemed to be the breakthrough that they both had sought. The weeks that followed seemed to restore the love and affection that they knew was never really lost. The old, silly arguments seemed to be a thing of the past. Any disagreements that did crop up were easily resolved. It certainly appeared that the lovebirds had returned to the Arnold household. The next week seemed almost surreal. The love that Ted and Barbara shared seemed to pervade the very atmosphere that surrounded them. Oh, it took work. They knew each other's buttons all too well. They had made a conscious decision to concentrate on what brought them together originally, not on the things that drove them apart. They had come to the realization that a successful marriage did require effort, and they both had vowed that they would never again forget that. Their new commitment to each other didn't go unnoticed. Everyone saw the difference in how they now interacted, and complimentary comments were made. Ted's boss, John Brock, seemed almost effusive when speaking to Ted about the changes he noticed in his friend's marriage. Their other friends were equally happy for them. especially Barbara's best friend, and Barbara were sharing cups of coffee in the Arnold's kitchen when Anne remarked again for the umpteenth time about the love that was now so evident in her friend's face. "Barb, I just can't tell you how happy I am for you. I just can't believe how things have turned around. Every time I see Ted, I can see how he adores you. Did you find a magic potion?" And laughed. Barbara smiled fondly at her friend.
"No, Anne."
We wised up finally. We came to realize that if we wanted our marriage to work, we would have to put the necessary effort into it. And I guess I always thought that love was enough. I was wrong. Hard work is necessary to nurture the love. Thank goodness we discovered that in time. Barbara then grinned at Anne. "Besides, we are like rabbits now. It's like our honeymoon. I now have the best of both worlds again," Barbara said impulsively, and then colored and quickly changed the subject by asking and how her relationship with Matt was going, and blushed an interesting shade of scarlet and cleared her throat. She cleared her throat again and hesitated. Barbara, a bit perplexed, looked at her friend. "What's up, Anne? Come on, spit it out," she teased. "Well, Barb, I think that it's time that Matt and I became oh heck," and looked at Barb almost pleadingly. "We haven't gone all the way yet, Barb," she finally blurted out. Barbara sat and just looked at her in amazement. She then just shook her head and asked, "Why the hell not, Anne? All these weeks, or is it months, and you haven't had it? I don't understand." "It's both of us, Barb," and sighed in frustration. "I think that we're both too worried about spoiling what we have. We both know that having it will certainly take us to a different level, and I think that we're both a little nervous about that. Barb, I know that he loves me, and I am sure that I care for him too. I think it's time that we made love, that we go all the way." "Honey," Barb stated, "I couldn't agree with you more, and I intend to help you achieve that goal. What we need is a plan." The following Wednesday saw Ted Arnold in Atlanta finishing up a training session with a group of programmers. He was amazed at how quickly they picked up on the quirks of the new program, and he began to see that his presence was not going to really be required for the entire 3 days. He would be able to finish up the session by the end of the day on Thursday, and perhaps he could get a late plane out of the airport. He would be home a full day early, and he had a few thoughts of surprising Barb and making reservations for a romantic weekend away somewhere. Things did work out as he had hoped, and he deplaned and strode out of the airport at 10:55 p.m. as scheduled. He couldn't wait to get home and surprise his wife. Fortunately, the traffic was light, and he was able to make it home in just 30 minutes. He saw his wife's car in the middle of the driveway and wondered why she hadn't moved it into the garage. The house was dark, and he entered silently, not wanting to wake her. He deposited his bag and briefcase on the floor and moved quietly up the staircase. Their bedroom door was open, and he quickly saw that there was no one in the bed and that the room was empty. He turned, puzzled, and his gaze moved down the hallway to the study door that was slightly ajar. He thought that he heard slight noises there as he walked to the door. He saw through the small crack in the door that while the room was unlit, he could tell from the soft sounds that someone was in there. He cautiously pushed the door open a bit more and looked in. He saw the moonlight streaming in the study window, illuminating the easy chair. He also saw, with a sickening feeling suddenly developing in his bowels, Barbara's little white number draped over the chair. The infamous dress from that Christmas party. Ted's eyes then moved, fearfully, to the sofa bed which he saw was open and occupied. In the shadows he saw two figures on the bed. It was obvious what they were doing as he watched them moving up and down. He heard the soft moans and then, "I love you." He couldn't make out most of the words, but the "I love you" was unmistakable. He watched as two female legs went up and across the hips of the man. Ted staggered back, his mind awhirl. He couldn't think straight, his thoughts muddled and chaotic. He felt the sweat cover his body. He stumbled across the thick carpeting in the hallway to the stairs and almost fell as he tried to maneuver his way down. Seconds later, he found himself outside with his bag and briefcase clutched in his hands. He stood, frozen for a moment. He felt lightheaded and weak. Breathing had become difficult. He moved, in a daze, to his car and sat behind the wheel. He lost all track of time. He didn't know how long he sat there. Why? 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 His mind screamed the question. Why had she done this to them? How long has she been around? He felt the desolation creep throughout his soul. He felt the emptiness, the sorrow, the grief. The tears flowed and he sobbed, knowing that his world had ended. He had no future. He faced only a pit of self-pity and regrets. Finally, the tears ebbed. He found he was exhausted, totally wrung out. He made a conscious effort to collect his thoughts, to put events in some kind of order. He started the car and drove, aimlessly. Ted then shook himself, almost violently, and headed for downtown. He pulled into the Hilton and got himself a room. Dropping his luggage on the floor and throwing his jacket onto the bed, he went into the bathroom and washed his face. Looking at himself in the mirror, he was shocked at his appearance. His face was drawn and haggard. He grimaced wryly. He would have to get used to a new appearance. He then removed his shoes and dropped into the easy chair. He felt a bit calmer. He was able to think a bit more rationally now. His mind went back in time to the incident before they married, catching her with her ex-boyfriend. Then again, without a hole at the Christmas party. Were those incidents as innocent then as she had claimed? Those were 2 times of which he was aware. How many other times were there? Incidents of which he was totally unaware. He didn't know her, he suddenly realized. He had no idea who his wife was. Was she schizophrenic? He asked himself, groping for answers. Ted wondered why he didn't just storm in and confront the bee. Why did he just stand frozen, unable to react? He then recognized that the shock was too great. The shock of actually seeing her with someone in their house, especially after they had seemed to be so successful at getting their marriage back on track. Ted sat and searched himself for the anger, the rage that should be infusing his mind. He felt little. He just felt an emptiness, a sense of loss, a love that was shattered and would never again be shared. After what seemed hours, Ted had a tentative handle in terms of what he was going to do. While he felt little anger, he wanted his wife to feel just a little of the hurt he was feeling. Perhaps it was vindictive, but he wanted her to feel some of what was now killing him. Ted moved to the desk after pulling a blank sheet of paper from his case. He picked up a pen and wrote, "Barbara, I'm leaving you. I found someone with whom I want to spend the rest of my life. Don't try to find me. I'm leaving the area. My lawyer will be serving you with divorce papers. Please do not contest it. Ted." Ted laughed bitterly to himself. Perhaps this would not be so hurtful after all. Perhaps this would make her happy, he thought to himself. He sat in the easy chair, going over what his moves would be in the morning, and fell into a fitful sleep around 4 a.m.